So Mel, I'll get my screen out of here and turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you for the introduction, Kurt, and thank you for the opportunity to present tonight. I just want to say that I am by trade a restoration ecologist, but I'm also an avid native plant gardener. And so I'm going to be sharing my experiences both from a professional and kind of a hobbyist perspective. So hopefully that works for most folks logging on tonight. I live in Ephrata, Washington, and I've lived in the Columbia Basin and been working in this environment since 2004. I did want to say a little bit more about BFI native seeds for those of you that are not familiar. BFI native seeds began growing native grass and wildflower seed in 1996. And we have a farm in Warden, Washington, just southeast of Moses Lake. We currently operate on about 2,000 acres, half of which is in commodity crops such as corn, peas, potatoes, and about half of which is in native seed production. And we grow both native grass and wildflower seed, and occasionally even shrub seed, native shrub seed, for sale for generally large-scale restoration projects, but also small acreage private land projects as well. Since 1996, we've grown over 700 different varieties of grasses and wildflowers, and our primary clients are agencies, but also NGOs and private landowners across the Western United States. So I just wanted to start with some really basic information and define what a native plant is. I found a definition I really like from the NRCS, or Natural Resources Conservation Service, and they define a native plant as a plant that is a part of the balance of nature that has developed over hundreds or thousands of years in a particular region or ecosystem. And so the geographic context of that definition is critical. So in other words, a plant that occurs, say, east of the Rocky Mountains, but not west in Washington state, is technically native to the United States, but is not an Eastern Washington native plant. So that's a very important distinction to keep in mind when something is labeled as a native plant. Is it really? Is it native to our area? It's worth investigating. And so why are we interested in using native plants, either in a wildland or a home landscape? Well, there's a couple of good reasons, I think. One of which is that when sited appropriately, they create very low maintenance landscapes and are sustainable for the long term for restoration type projects. But secondly, and perhaps most importantly, native plants are an essential part of the food web in a given area. And they provide habitat for native insects in particular, and which are a primary food source for birds and other wildlife. But don't take my word for this. Anyone who's interested in really learning about the relationship between native plants and animals, there's a great presentation, free webinar scheduled for next month on April 10th. And it features an entomologist from the University of Delaware named Doug Tallamy, and he's written a couple of great books about using native plants in the home landscape. And he's got some really great research that kind of ties insect abundance to native plants, as opposed to kind of the traditional landscaping plants and lawns that we all like to use. So anyway, it's through the Washington Native Plant Society, and you can find information for it on their website, and registration was still open when I signed up yesterday evening. So just as an overview of my presentation, I'm going to spend most of the time today on the way that I go about selecting appropriate native plants for a particular project, and talk about the two critical features, moisture availability and soils. And so in native plantings, it's best to either match the moisture requirements of the plants with the available moisture of a given site, unless you're interested in irrigating for extended time periods. And if you're not, it's best to select plants that can persist with minimal irrigation or watering. I'm also going to briefly talk about the native wildflowers that we've seen on our farm in Warden that are great hosts for pollinating species, because this is a particular interest right now, in particular with kind of nationwide declines in native pollinators. I'm going to cover the different types of plant materials that are available and commonly used, and talk about situations where one type of plant material would be preferred over another, and kind of help you as landowners select what's right for your project or for your landscape. I'm going to briefly touch on this idea of genetic provenance, which basically just is a fancy way of referring to the geographic origin of the plant materials that you're using. In other words, where the seed originally came from. I'm going to talk about kind of how critical that can be in kind of a sustainable, low maintenance landscape. I'm going to talk about planting methods and timing, and finally, long-term maintenance, including irrigation, fertilization, and weeding. So if that doesn't sound of interest to you, now's a good time to say goodbye. No, I'm just kidding. Hopefully everybody will stick around. So the first step for determining which native plants are appropriate for your native planting project is to determine the moisture availability at your planting site, and what kind of native habitat it naturally supports. And then you can select plants that have similar moisture needs. And so this is a map that I created of the Wenatchee Valley area and surrounding areas using a tool developed by the U.S. Forest Service, and this is called the Provisional Seed Zone Map. And basically they've modeled elevation and rainfall and precipitation to determine and kind of lump together similar climates, so that when you're selecting plant materials, you know whether or not they come from an area that's got a similar climate to your site. This is a tool that we use all of the time in our restoration work. So it's based on temperatures and kind of like the USDA plant hardiness zones that I'm sure all gardeners have looked at before, with the added element of precipitation, in other words, rainfall and snowfall. So as you can see from this map, most of the Wenatchee Valley and western Douglas County area falls into area classified as semi-arid, with small patches of arid towards Rock Island and north towards Chelan, and most of the area east towards the center of the Columbia Basin is classified as arid as well, kind of where I live in Ephrata. And so native vegetation, native plant communities in these areas, shaded orange and red, are typically shrub steppe habitat. And I'll talk about what shrub steppe really means in a bit. But then heading west up the Wenatchee River Valley or higher elevations in the foothills, the climate becomes what's termed semi-humid and transitions to more of a woodland or forest habitat. And then moister areas within either of these zones, say along a riparian area or in a draw bottom, support moist site or riparian species. So these are the three main plant communities that we encounter in our area: shrub steppe, forest, and riparian. And so using this map along with the kind of the location of your site, you should be able to predict which of these plant communities would be appropriate for use at your site. Assuming that you're looking for a low maintenance, no irrigation plant community. So of course, if you live in like an area that's mapped as kind of semi-arid, which would support shrub steppe, of course you can grow species that occur in woodlands, but you should be aware that irrigation will be needed, likely for an extended time period. So that's just something to keep in mind. I grow many woodland or moisture site species on my property and irrigate them, and they certainly thrive and they provide excellent habitat. So it's not to discourage you, just to let you know that irrigation will likely be needed. So the first of these plant communities, shrub steppe, is characterized by a layer of relatively short shrubs, wildflowers, and bunch grasses. And bunch grasses are basically clumping grasses that generally clump together and are about 12 inches or so in diameter, with large spaces between grasses. Some really great workhorse species that we use for shrubs include sagebrush, which is an important critical habitat for a lot of birds and other animals. The height of sagebrush can vary greatly depending on the type that you get, the variety. Some varieties stay 3 feet or less, and some can grow up to 12 feet in height and look a little bit closer to trees. But they require very minimal additional moisture and prefer to be grown in full sun. Another shrub steppe shrub that's commonly used is bitterbrush. And bitterbrush generally gets up to about 6 feet tall and is covered with kind of small yellow blooms. It flowers in the late spring and is a preferred deer forage and important pollinator species. It's particularly important deer forage in the winter. For bunch grasses, one of the most common species that we use is called blue bunch wheatgrass. This grass grows up to 2 feet tall and is actually the official Washington state grass. So that tells you about how common it is in eastern Washington. Blue bunch wheatgrass grows in the cooler part of the year and without any extra water will go dormant and turn brown in the summer months, typically late June through August. And then it may green up in the late fall or early spring and kind of start the cycle all over again. But it's typically growing in the cooler months of the year. Another ubiquitous common species is Sandberg's bluegrass. This is a shorter statured bunch grass that grows mainly through the winter and actually goes dormant even a little earlier than blue bunch wheatgrass, typically by late April, early May. Again, both of these species require minimal or no extra water, but do require full sun. And then one of my favorite bunch grasses, Idaho fescue. This grass has kind of a grayish green foliage often, and is commonly used in native grass turf mixes. Because it's kind of got a soft texture. This species occurs in mainly more moist areas, like northerly aspects of kind of the shrub steppe zone or higher elevations. So it does require a little bit more moisture than blue bunch wheatgrass and Sandberg's bluegrass. And again, it typically grows about 18 to 24 inches tall. There is an enormous diversity of wildflowers native to shrub steppe. Too many to cover today, but I will mention a few of my favorites that we've found relatively easy to establish, both in the landscape, home landscape and restoration projects. Snow buckwheat has a grayish foliage and white or pink flowers, and is a really important pollinator species due to the timing of its flowering, which is in late summer or early fall. Lewis flax, another important pollinator species. It's also known as blue flax, but that can be a little confusing because there's an introduced species from Europe that's also called blue flax. So it's always important to double check that you're getting the native species of flax when you're looking at your local nursery. The best way to refer to it is Lewis's flax, and you'll be sure you're getting the native variety. This is a really drought tolerant flower. It grows up to 2 feet tall and produces showy blue flowers in the early summer. And one of my favorite species to use is fleabane daisy. And there's several species in the shrub steppe, shaggy, threadleaf, linear leaf, cushion, different colors, different heights. Most of them are relatively short, under 12 inches. And most of them flower in the mid to late spring. Again, all of these species have minimal additional water requirements in our area, but do require full sun, and many of them will go dormant, turn brown, and kind of die back in the middle of summer. So those are the shrub steppe species that I would consider great places to start and good workhorse species, easy to establish. And with that, I'm going to talk a little bit more about woodland type species. Obviously, in woodlands and forests, you start to see trees. The most common of which native trees you would encounter are ponderosa pine, which can grow over 100 feet. And Douglas fir would be the second common tree in our area. There's also a wide diversity of kind of taller shrubs that you start to see in woodland areas. There's a diversity of them from snowberry to currants. Woods rose is one of my favorite and is a big component of my home landscape. It's got some beautiful pink flowers in kind of the mid-spring. Generally grows to about between 4 and 6 feet tall. In woodland and forested areas, bunch grasses, such as the species I discussed earlier, still occur, but There are additional grasses that are kind of have more of a spreading growth type or rhizomatous growth type. My favorite is pine grass, which is just a beautiful, vibrant green that kind of carpets the understory areas under pine and fir overstories. It generally stays pretty vegetative, and in other words, it doesn't produce seed unless it's stimulated by fire. Which you can see in the photo here, this site had recently burned, and it stimulated all of the kind of feathery seed production that you see here. Pine grass and some other woodland species are more tolerant of shade, but most of them do really well in full sun as well. And blue wild rye is another really commonly used forested grass species. This is taken on one of our seed production plots in Warden. We grow a lot of blue wild rye. It's used a lot in road decommissioning projects on the forest, as well as post logging. Really easy to establish. Generally grows about 4 to 5 feet tall and is tolerant of sun and kind of partial shade. Again, a number of different flowers to choose from in woodland habitats. This is a picture from our farm of a showy or aspen fleabane daisy seed production plot. This species is just a tremendous pollinator species and also very easy to grow. I've got it in my front yard, and it's survived and thrived for over 10 years now. And of course, blanket flower is another easy forb to grow, easy flower to grow. Both of these species are tolerant of a little bit of partial shade, but really thrive in full sun as well. Blanket flower gets generally, it's probably less than 2 feet tall, and it flowers later in the summer, which also makes it an important pollinator species, as there's less flowers that are flowering at that time of the year. I do want to say that unlike most of the shrub steppe species, woodland species will tend to stay green longer in the summer. They might still have a period of dormancy during the heat of the summer, but a lot of them will actually stay green throughout the summer. So that's an important consideration if fire is a concern. And hopefully all of you all have watched Al's presentation 2 weeks back regarding Firewise for the home landscape. It's definitely an important consideration when plants are turning brown and going dormant during the most fire sensitive times of the year. And so last, the kind of moist site areas along rivers and in bottoms support riparian communities. And these are moisture loving plants. Most willows, cottonwood, water birch, a lot of alder, all of these species occur naturally along creeks. And if they're planted in the home landscape, will require a lot of irrigation, likely for an extended time period. This is a beautiful picture of a cottonwood. These trees can grow up to about 100 feet tall, really showy fall color, but again, relatively high water needs. And so I think, probably the most appropriate place for a lot of these riparian plants is restoration or habitat projects, or again, home landscapes that will be watered extensively. Most riparian plants thrive in full sun, but can tolerate partial shade as well. So there's a lot of different plants out there, and it can be challenging to determine, which, are from the right plant community, right habitat. And so I'm going to try to point you guys to some different sources that you can use to determine what the water needs of plants you're interested are. And one of the best sources I found is a publication from the Columbia Basin chapter of the the Washington Native Plant Society. And while this chapter is located in the Tri-Cities, a lot of the plant species are similar to what occurs in the Wenatchee Valley. And so this is just a screenshot of one page of this handout that's available online. And Kirk will be emailing out links to all of these documents that I'm referencing afterwards. But you can see that they've got a column in here indicated, they call soil type, but it's really indicating moisture needs, with plants marked with A being kind of adaptable, needing some water, but not too high a need. D being dry site plants that need minimal water, and M being kind of those high moisture needs plants. And so this is a great reference for anyone who's just kind of starting out from scratch without kind of knowing what plants they want to grow in their home landscape. There's also some great information on mature height and just kind of the colors and bloom, leaf and bloom colors of the plants.
Mel, I did post that in the chat. So.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kurt. And then another great source is the local native plant nurseries or local seed vendors. And this is a screenshot from Derby Canyon Native's website. And it lists just a small fraction of the shrubs that they have available, and kind of has a column that indicates the drought tolerance. And so the more X's in the column, the more drought tolerant these species are. And so you can kind of weed through and select plants based on how much moisture you have at your site or how much you're interested in irrigating. And then one other critical component of kind of the site analysis is, in addition to the soil moisture, is determining what the soil texture is at your site. This is a really critical step in restoration project planning because restoration projects have minimal irrigation or maintenance, and that means that the species that we select have to be adapted to the soils and climate in order to persist long term. In landscaping, it's also important, particularly if minimal irrigation is planned. And primarily it's important because soil texture can influence the aridity or dryness of a site. Sandy or cobbly soils have large soil particles and larger pore spaces between particles, and meaning that these soils drain faster. They hold less moisture, and they make sites functionally drier than, say, a nearby site with like a good loamy textured soil. So my favorite way for determining soil texture is to conduct a jar test, which is easy to do with a quart-sized mason jar, a cup full of soil that you've kind of screened rocks out of, and the document that I've referenced here gives a great rundown on how to do this test. But basically you just shake the jar with water and let it settle out into layers. The clay, silt, and sand will settle out differently at different speeds, and then you can measure the height of these in the jar and come up with a composition that will help you determine your soil type. So, and And then you can then go back to the Washington Native Plant Society document I referenced before and look at the lists that they've included where they've kind of put specialty species for the different soil types. Sandy and rocky soils, if you're not interested in irrigating, should really be planted with adapted species that are kind of adapted to that well-drained, low moisture holding ability of these sites. And so a final consideration that I hope everybody takes into account in their landscape is including plants that support pollinators and other beneficial insects, or really any insects. So for this, the best approach includes species that flower at different times of the year through the spring, summer, and fall. And there's a lot of great resources out there that can help you select pollinator species. The Xerces Society is a great resource, but BFI actually has produced a resource as well. Kelsey Prickett, our wildflower seed production manager for over 10 years, produced this document, which Kirk will email out after the presentation. It's just a PDF, and this was based on her observations of the pollinators that used our seed production plots. And again, we've got some information in here on bloom timing, water requirements, and the different types of pollinators that these plants support. So include pollinating species in your home landscape if you can. I highly recommend it. So that's kind of the nutshell, in a nutshell, the process I go through in determining plant selection. And I'm going to pause here briefly and answer some questions before moving on.
Yeah, Mel, couple of questions related to the moisture. So one is that U.S. Forest Service moisture availability tool, is that available to the public?
It is, yes. And I've got I think that was in that list of resources that I emailed you, and it can be accessed either on a mobile device or on a PC, and you can zoom in as close as you can right to your site to determine what the kind of climate is at your project site. And yes, so available for anybody to use.
Is that the TRM's seed zone map?
It is, yeah.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
And I'll put a link to that in here in a minute then after questions. So, and as far as moisture availability up at Manson, how would you describe that?
It's probably in that semi-arid range, with possibly very quickly transitioning to woodland as you go off the lake. I've only been into Manson a few times, but that's my recollection. It's probably shrub steppe right along the lake, and then very quickly moving into forest as you go up the mountain. Does that seem accurate, Kirk?
I'm not an expert on Manson either, so I'm not sure. And so any shrubs that are over 6 feet that you'd recommend for a shrub steppe? Something like chokecherry?
There are a lot of shrubs that occur in moister areas in shrub steppe, but none that are, would require minimal irrigation. I grow serviceberry, chokecherry. Those both get above 6 feet. Elderberry, but they will, if you're in the Wenatchee Valley, lower elevation, they will need to be on a drip system in order to survive. And I've got elderberry actually growing in my lawn, and so it gets watered at the same cycle as my lawn grass, and that seems to keep it pretty happy. So they do need quite a bit of extra moisture in order to persist in kind of this semi-arid or arid type areas.
A couple of questions related to clay soil. How does having a clay soil kind of fit in the big picture, and then how do you suggest planting seeds in a clay soil in a very humid area and getting them to make it?
Well, I'm going to defer the question of planting seeds until later because I do talk about seeding. But clays in general have that finer soil texture, and so they do hold moisture better, but then when they do dry out, they also have a tendency to become just extremely hard on the surface. So that's actually a challenge. We don't actually have very many clay soils in the areas that I'm used to working. Yeah, I'm not really prepared to answer that one. Seeding in clays, I think you would want to do it probably in the early fall before there's any substantial rainfall, and just make sure yeah, that you can get in there and get the seed seeded before it gets extreme. It also gets extremely slimy in clay soils. So I think timing for seeding in clay soils would be really important. I'll talk more about seeding later on in the presentation, and then maybe we can revisit that question.
And here's a kind of a native versus non-native question. So if you're going to a nursery and you're trying to find something to attract bees, for instance, why pick a native over something like lavender?
Well, I'm going to refer you guys to Doug Talamy's presentation on that. I caught his webinar over or a webinar that he'd given last summer, and he makes a pretty convincing case using research studies that show that the native insect abundance and diversity is substantially higher on native plants as opposed to landscaping plants, kind of traditional landscaping plants, and was able to show through research that the impacts that has through the food web in terms of increased bird nest success and productivity because of the increased insect abundance. So lavender in particular, yes, does support pollinator species. I'm not suggesting that nobody, you can't include some non-native species in your landscape, not at all. But the evidence that I've seen suggests that for native insects, the native plants are the best fit. They're what, they're part of the community that these insects evolved with and are adapted to.
And let's take one more and then move on, and then we'll have time for Q&A because we have a couple actually here. But your thoughts on Oregon white oak trees?
Oregon white oak is native to kind of the east crest of the Cascades, kind of south of I-90. And I believe there's some populations up in the Methow as well. So it's a very slow growing species. I personally tried to propagate it several times, and it's just be prepared to be very patient. Oaks are an awesome, food source for a lot of wildlife. So it can be a great species for a habitat planting as long as you're patient.
Okay. Actually, if you have time for one more, we have one more and then we'll be
okay.
done. Is pine grass best planted from seed or from starts?
Starts, because seed is very challenging to come by. We've tried to grow it multiple times on our farm in Warden, and even trying to incorporate burning into our production method, it just makes very, very low low viability seed, and it's just very unproductive. So it's just we haven't quite figured out how to grow it well enough to make it cost effective enough for, you know, folks to use. So yes, I mean, you could collect small quantities of yourself by hand for a very small area, but in general, starts are probably the best option for that.
All right, thanks.
So I'm going to dive into plant materials and talk about these a little more. The two main types of plant materials that are available are seeds and live plants. We use seeds for larger scale projects, typically greater than the size of your backyard. When you're talking, you know, ½ acre plus to multiple acres, seeds are one of the most cost-effective approaches. Grasses in particular are very commonly seeded. Shrubs and forbs are a little bit more challenging to establish from seed. A lot of them have dormancy issues, which basically means that they need to be exposed to cold, moist winter conditions in order to germinate. And so these can be a little bit more challenging for the typical layman to use. And so live plants are typically used for these more challenging species like forbs or wildflowers and shrubs. And we also use live plants in small or medium sized projects that they're just functionally too small to bother with moving equipment in to seed. And they're very easily planted with a relatively small number of plants. Another note to consider on seeding. Seeding requires generally much more substantial site preparation work and weed control in order to create a lot of bare soil so that you can get good seed to soil contact, which is really critical for native species. They can't just be broadcasted onto the ground on top of litter and be expected to establish well. They need to be ideally planted under the soil at about 1/4 to 1/2 inch in depth. And so we typically fallow or control all of the weeds on a project site for 2 full growing seasons prior to seeding in order to get a successful establishment. And this is just because, you know, as very tiny germinates, a lot of these native seeds are just poorly competitive with weeds. And so we really have to reduce the competition in seed bank prior to seeding. Whereas live plants require a lot less preparation and weed control because they're generally at least 9 months old when they're planted, if not older, and therefore a lot more competitive. We will scalp or, you know, basically scrape back the plants around a planting site and then just go ahead and plant the plant into it, a live plant into it. So a lot less pre-planting work goes in when you're using live plants. Another great source that Betsy referenced in her presentation is through the Washington Native Plant Society. And this document that I've listed here, it basically lists all of the native seed and live plant vendors in Washington State, gives their contact information. So if you're wondering where to get your plants or seed, this is a fantastic source, and it's generally updated every year or few years when there's new vendors. And then one brief note on genetic provenance before we move on from plant materials. When I say genetic provenance, I'm really just talking about the geographic location that a specific plant material was originally collected from. And this is critical to know for restoration projects, which are expected to persist over decades, if not longer, with little management. Again, for restoration or low maintenance native plantings, we use this U.S. Forest Provisional Seed Zone map to determine the seed zone of our planting site and try to match that to the extent possible with plant materials. And it's simply not possible to match exactly sometimes, but we try to get as close as possible. Matching the genetic origin of plant materials to your home landscape is critical, is less critical, but it's still a consideration. So in other words, matching, like say the annual rainfall might not be critical if you can irrigate, but temperatures, particularly winter low temperatures, are important. So if you consider, say, Saskatoon serviceberry, which is a common woodland species that occurs in the Wenatchee River Valley. This species is found all throughout the western U.S., across the Rockies into the Great Plains and north to Alaska. So obviously, if you're trying to plant a site in the Wenatchee Valley, you're going to want to determine that your plant stock came from a relatively local source, so that it doesn't say come from a Western Washington source where it's just not adapted to the low temperatures or the low temperatures that we experience in our area that are not as common on the west side. So definitely a consideration when you're buying your plant materials to know where the seed that it was propagated from originally came from, so that you can determine if it's a good match. Maybe just a really brief pause there, because I'm kind of running over. Or Kirk, do you want to just move on and we can take questions at the end?
Yeah, that's fine. You can go on.
Okay, I'm going to keep going. I want to keep everybody up past their bedtime. My bedtime too. And so I'm finally I'm going to get into kind of the nuts and bolts of planting. And one of the most critical things that we've found is using the proper timing, particularly if you're going to be seeding. Seeding should occur during the dormant season. And you can see my colleague Linda here unrolling some grass seedlings here, and she's bundled up, got a hat and, you know, warm clothes on. We like to plant during the cool time of the year. And this allows the plants to kind of get through transplant shock and grow substantial root mass before the hot summer months when many plants go dormant. So in the Wenatchee Valley, this dormant window typically opens in late October and continues through February or even March at higher elevations. And if you are planning on irrigating or watering, the planting window can be extended greatly. Just in general, avoid the hot months of July and August for planting. It's just extremely hard to water plants enough in order to get them to survive at that time of the year. I do still recommend that seeding occur in that kind of dormant period. And this is mainly because even if you're irrigating, it's just extremely hard to keep the soils moist enough in, like, say, a warm, windy spring day. Soil moisture, particularly on the surface, is just really hard to maintain. So seed it during the dormant period if at all possible. We like to target the following plant spacings. Grasses and flowers, typically 2 to 3 feet on center, shrubs 3 to 6 feet, and trees 8 to 12 feet on center. If you're not planning on doing much irrigating, maybe target the lower end of these ranges and plan for some mortality, because that's likely to occur without some supplemental watering. We take natural mortality into account on all of our restoration projects. It's just something that will happen. Planting methods for native plants are the same really for any landscaping plant. You dig a hole at least to the depth of your container. You place the plant in the hole such that the root crown or base of the stem is right at soil level, and then you backfill, ideally without any rocks, and compact the soil lightly with your hands or light foot pressure, no stomping. If possible, create a watering basin around the plant by creating kind of like a 2-inch tall berm, and water the plant in well, if at all possible. Native plants often don't require much in terms of fertilization. If you do choose to fertilize, I recommend like a slow release type kind of balanced fertilizer or compost. And this is applied to the soil surface around the base of the plant after planting. If you've got good topsoil at your site, fertilization probably isn't critical because native plants are adapted to kind of the native low fertility soils in our area. But then again, if you're in an area where it's a recent construction and the topsoil has been graded off and you're working with topsoil, compost would definitely be beneficial. And then one of the most critical things is to mulch, and then mulch some more. This is such an important step, and it's really critical for low maintenance plantings. Mulching reduces competition from weeds, meaning you have to do less weeding around the plant, and reduces soil moisture loss. And so around each plant, we typically mulch in a 2 to 3 foot diameter circle with at least 3 to 4 inches of mulch, except right around the base of the plant where you need to keep it a little thinner. Our favorite product for restoration projects is called hog fuel. It's basically a long fiber shredded wood product, but you can use whatever mulch matches your home landscape. We also use, types of rock, fabric, or mats. All of those can be utilized and are effective as mulch. Protection from animals is important if that's a known issue around your site. And you can use a couple of different products. For larger plants, we generally use a welded wire kind of cage that's left up for numerous years until the plants are kind of grown above the browse height. For smaller seedlings, you can use what's known as a rigid seedling protector, this picture on the right there, and that's kind of a mesh product that keeps deer off of small seedlings. Irrigation can be done either by hand, using an installed system, or by broadcast. Plants that only need occasional water are probably the only type that you would want to water by hand. A really good approach for regular watering is an installed system using drip or micro sprinkler emitters. I use primarily drip emitters in my home landscape, and I've learned over the years that it's really critical to group the plants based on water needs, like within the site and within the station of your irrigation system. And so, this is to ensure that plants with higher moisture needs can continue to be watered throughout the summer when, say, other plants, drier site plants, are going dormant and don't need water. I generally discourage the use of broadcast irrigation except for maybe smaller grass areas. And this is mainly just due to the weed issues that often come about with broadcast irrigation, because you're watering an entire area rather than just a discrete site at the base of the plant that you're trying to establish. The greatest need for watering in any native planting is year one. Beyond that, if you've selected plants that are adapted to your site and soils, you may be able to reduce or eliminate watering. But it's always a good idea to supplement watering a bit, a few times during the first growing season to make sure the plant gets well established. So hopefully, if your native landscape is well thought out, maintenance should be fairly minimal after the first growing season. Shrub step plants will go dormant during the summer, but weekly watering can keep them growing longer, and will often increase the length of the flowering period. But you can overwater shrub step plants, so make sure to monitor the soil moisture around the base of the plant and look for signs of stress in that plant. And if the plant in the middle of the heat of summer begins to go dormant, I don't recommend fighting that. That's just a natural habit that they have, and it's hard to keep them from going dormant if that's where they're headed. Continue to weed around the base of the plants to reduce competition and maintain that browse protection until the plants have grown above the browse line, which is generally about 5 feet tall for deer. So just a few final thoughts. In general, plant selection should be based on the moisture requirements and the landowner's desire to irrigate. And lower elevation sites within the Wenatchee Valley will support shrub step native species, and any other natives selected will require extended irrigation. There's a lot of great sources and experts available to help with plant selection, including the Washington Native Plant Society, and they've got an amazing website, as well as local nurseries and seed vendors. Mulching is the key for low maintenance and hopefully long-term maintenance of your native plantings will be minimal. Thank you so much to Cascadia for inviting me. Anybody who's interested in further discussions is welcome to contact me on this email address, or you can contact BFI directly. Our phone number and a generic email is available on our website. So with that, I will take any final questions.
All right, thanks, Mel. Yeah, so could you repeat the diameter of the area to be mulched around the plants that you mentioned?
2 to 3 feet. 3 feet's best. And that's a diameter, so, approximately 1.5 foot radius around the base of the plant.
And should you pile it up very deep?
Yes. Yep. Yeah, 4 inches is kind of what we're targeting. And so sometimes we'll even go a little heavier, a little thicker. We'll go up to 6 inches. And then after, it goes through winter, it settles down and you've got a good solid 4-inch layer there. And that's kind of what's necessary to keep out weeds.
You're going to repeat that every year, or?
No, the mulch will get spread around a little bit, but no, this is just a one-time application for the most part, unless there's a lot of displacement for some reason. But that's not typically something we do on our restoration projects.
Okay. Should a homeowner just in their yard remulch every year, or?
If it looks like it's thinning out and you're getting weeds popping up, then yes, that's a sign that you might want to put a little thicker layer on, and you might not need to put this, same amount back on, but you could add another inch or two, and try to keep the weeds down.
And you're talking about protecting from animals. How about from marmots? How do you protect from marmots?
I don't know the answer to that question. Marmots. I think a wire cage, the marmots, they don't tunnel. I think a wire cage probably would be effective against marmots. You might need to kind of secure it, staple it into the ground so it can't be lifted up. Yeah, I can't say I've ever had anybody or a project site that ever had marmot depredation. That's a new one.
So for blanket flower, you recommend seeds or starts?
So blanket flower is actually one of the flowers that does not have tricky stratification requirements. You can just seed it. There's really only a handful of native flowers that you can seed at any, in the spring and will pop right up and do well. So you could go either way with blanket flower, and another one that doesn't need that overwintering is yarrow, western yarrow. So you could go either way on those. If you had a big area, you could certainly try. It'd be worth trying seeds.
And somebody asked about sending photos for plant ID. So I'm assuming for our Q&A next week, the form I'm going to send out, you can actually add pictures.
Okay.
And so if somebody wanted to take a picture of their yard and ask a question about that or a specific plant. So I'm not sure if he's asking specifically if he can send you photos or.
Well, I actually have a really great suggestion for that for anybody who's on Facebook. The Washington Native Plant Society Facebook group is basically a group of plant nerds who they love it when people send them photos of plants and say, what is this? And there's always 20 people jumping on to identify the plant. And so it's a really great resource for anybody who is on Facebook. Hit up the Washington Native Plant Society Facebook page.
And can you take cuttings and root native shrubs like serviceberry?
You can do it with a lot of native shrubs. It's a shrub like serviceberry is not commonly propagated by stem cuttings. We typically, collect the seed and seed that. There are a few upland shrubs that, we commonly do from cuttings I'm blanking it right now, but the the willows and cottonwoods and dogwoods, those all establish really well from cuttings, but the upland species are a little bit more challenging.
When would you recommend taking the cuttings and starting them?
For riparian species, they always recommend dormant cuttings. So basically after the leaves start to drop in the fall until bud formation begins in the spring. That's the best time.
And how do you recommend amending poor clay soil in dry environments?
I would try to incorporate either some compost or sand and trying to fully till it into the soil profile in order to increase the draining of a clay soil like that. That's what I would try. Maybe probably both of those, a little bit of sand and or compost, basically just to allow those soils to drain a little faster so they don't get as hard when they dry out.
And if you want to collect your own specimens of native plants, what's the proper protocol? Is that allowed? Does the Forest Service regulate that if you're on Forest Service land?
It is regulated for commercial use. There's different rules with different landowners. There's a few, I believe that on BLM land, you can collect a very small amount of native seed as long as it's, you know, done in a non-destructive way, like less than a pound for personal use without getting a permit. I believe that's the case that I had this discussion in terms of collecting sagebrush seed last fall. So I believe that's the case, and I don't know if the U.S. Forest Service has similar regulations, so you would just want to call the ranger district. We collect large quantities of native seed, and so we always get commercial seed collection permits, which is required for any business that's collecting seed.
Is manure a good additive for native plants?
I've had a couple of rough situations with steer manure. You know, as long as it's really well composted and really well broken up, and you didn't mix in you know, a high percentage of it, I think it would be fine. The issue that I've run into is that it tends to come in very large clumps, and it's just sometimes it's not very well composted, and so it certainly smells like there's high levels of nitrogen still you know, in the compost that could be, you know, kind of too hot for a planting. So that's something to look out for. It's definitely not my favorite choice for compost. I like mint. We get a lot of mint compost because of the mint production in the basin, and so I like to use that. That's my preference.
And so you were talking about digging the hole and refilling the hole when you're planting. So I've read some things about you should add in like compost and a high quality soil, and other people say use the native soil. What is your recommendation for that?
Compost is fine if you have it. I don't think it's critical unless you've got challenging soil conditions like really sandy or rocky or you know, maybe clay soils. If you've got a nice loamy topsoil, it certainly wouldn't hurt, but it certainly isn't necessary. And generally, we usually put the fertilizer or the compost just on the soil surface when we're just using it as a source of kind of as a food source, as opposed to like a soil amendment where we're trying to change the feature of the soil, if that makes sense.
All right. Any other questions? I think we've covered all of them that we have so far. So, well, I think we'll wrap it up then. Mel, thank you very much.
This is my assistant.
Thanks, Mel.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for participating.
Thank you very much for joining us. So I will send an email out with the PDF of Mel's presentation, and this was recorded, and we'll put it on our YouTube channel like we did the others, and I'll send out her resources as well, and get you some information about next week's Q&A. So thank you very much. Have a good evening.